A millionaire was in a state of a coma. When his wife decided to turn off life support, the nurse came close and fell on his knee with what he saw on the bed. In a hushed room, softened by the steady hum of medical machines, a man lay still, a millionaire whose name once dominated headlines, now reduced to a fragile body tethered to life by tubes and wires. The hospital suite was a contrast of sterile functionality and muted opulence, a reflection of the life he had led. On the walls, a few family portraits hung alongside clinical charts, their smiles frozen in happier times. The millionaire, James Harrow, had slipped into a coma weeks earlier after a sudden cardiac event. His doctors had tried everything, but his prognosis was grim. His wife, Eleanor, had been by his side every day, her stoic exterior a thin veil for the turmoil inside. The whispers in the hospital corridors were unanimous. His time was running out. Among the staff was a young nurse named David Lawson, who had been assigned to James's care. David was known for his empathy, often lingering longer than necessary at patients' bedsides, listening to their stories when no one else would. For him, nursing wasn't just a profession, it was a calling. But even he found the weight of this case daunting. It wasn't just the millionaire's condition. It was the profound silence of a man who had once been larger than life. That day, the decision had been made. Eleanor, the devoted wife, had finally signed the papers. James's life support would be withdrawn. David had been tasked with preparing for the procedure. He took a deep breath as he entered the room, unsure of the emotions that awaited him. Eleanor sat at her husband's bedside, her elegant posture betraying the exhaustion etched into her face. The fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp shadows, emphasizing the weariness in her eyes. She held James's hand gently, her fingers trembling as she traced the veins that used to pulse with vitality. The weight of the decision she had made hung heavily in the room, tangible and suffocating. It hadn't been an easy choice. For weeks, Eleanor had clung to the hope that James would wake up. She had prayed, bargained with fate, and consulted every specialist she could find. But the doctors were unyielding in their conclusions. The man she loved was gone in every way that mattered, and keeping him on life support would only prolong the inevitable. Still, guilt gnawed at her. What if the doctors were wrong? What if James was still in there, fighting to return to her? She looked at him now, his face gaunt and pale, almost unrecognizable. Her mind wandered to memories of their life together, the laughter they had shared, the dreams they had chased, and the arguments that seemed so trivial now. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "I'm sorry, James. I don't know what else to do." Her voice cracked, the sound filling the sterile room with raw emotion. She bent down and kissed his forehead, lingering as though she could imprint her love into his unconscious mind. As she straightened, her resolve hardened. She had to believe she was doing the right thing for him, if not for herself. She turned to the nurse standing by the door, signaling that the time had come. David hesitated for a moment, seeing the anguish in her expression, before nodding solemnly and stepping forward. David Lawson stood outside the door of the suite for a moment, steadying himself. He had seen this situation many times in his career, yet something about James Harrow's case felt different. Maybe it was the way Eleanor looked at her husband. Not just with grief, but with a lingering thread of hope, thin and frayed but unbroken. Or maybe it was the subtle rhythm of the machines, as though they were unwilling to let go of their patient either. Pushing the door open, David entered the room with careful steps. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor calm, but inside, his thoughts swirled. As he approached the bed, he glanced at Eleanor, whose face was set in an expression of resigned determination. Her tear-streaked cheeks told a different story. David had spent weeks caring for James. He had learned the small details that made the man human, not just a name on a chart. The faint scar above his left eyebrow, the faint twitch in his hand when he was turned. Those details had stayed with him, as they always did. Yet today, David felt the weight of his profession more than ever. His role was to ease suffering, but today, that responsibility seemed to blur with the task of ending hope. He checked the monitors one last time, out of habit more than necessity. His hands moved deftly, ensuring everything was in place for the withdrawal process. Eleanor's eyes followed his every motion, her lips pressed into a thin line. As he stepped closer to James's side, he noticed something, a faint, almost imperceptible flutter of the eyelids. He paused, squinting slightly to see if his mind was playing tricks on him. No, it couldn't be. Shaking the thought away, he prepared to begin. Then, in a moment that would haunt him for days, his knees nearly buckled as his gaze locked on James's hand. It twitched, not a reflexive spasm, but deliberate, almost purposeful. Eleanor Harrow was known in elite circles for her sharp mind and steely resolve. A businesswoman in her own right, she had built a reputation for making tough decisions, a trait that had served her well alongside James in their climb to the top. But here, in this hospital room, she was no titan of industry, just a woman losing the love of her life. Her carefully maintained facade cracked in the quiet moments, revealing the depth of her grief and doubt. David Lawson, on the other hand, was a stark contrast to the world Eleanor inhabited. A nurse from a modest background, he had chosen this profession after watching his own mother succumb to a long illness. His empathy made him stand out among his colleagues, but it also burdened him in cases like this. He often got too involved, his heart refusing to detach from his hands. The doctors who attended to James were experienced professionals, but their clinical detachment was evident. For them, James was another name, another case. The neurologist had laid out the facts weeks ago. Brain scans showed minimal activity, and every test confirmed the grim prognosis. You have to consider quality of life, they had told Eleanor in their calm, rehearsed tones. But Eleanor had resisted for as long as she could bear. David had no illusions about his place in this narrative. He was the caregiver, the silent observer. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't ignore the strange sensation he felt when he saw James's hand move. It was a thread that pulled at his instincts, urging him to stay vigilant, even as others prepared for an ending. The room was quiet when Eleanor finally spoke, her voice brittle but firm. "I've decided. It's time." She glanced at David, her tone brooking no argument. Her trembling hands betrayed the certainty her words tried to convey. David nodded, though his stomach churned. He respected the decision, but the moment he had witnessed moments earlier, James's hand twitching, refused to leave his mind. He told himself it was a muscle reflex, a common occurrence in comatose patients. Yet doubt lingered. "When are we doing this?" Eleanor asked, her eyes fixed on the floor. "The doctor is finalizing the schedule," David said gently. "Likely by the evening." He paused, then added, "Mrs. Harrow, may I ask, are you absolutely certain about this? I know it's not my place, but—" His words faltered as her gaze snapped up, sharp and defensive. "I've waited," she replied, her voice rising with emotion. "I've waited and prayed and hoped. But he's not coming back." Her tone softened into a whisper, as though she were trying to convince herself. "He's not in there anymore." David opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. Instead, he nodded respectfully and left the room to give her space. Yet his unease grew with each passing moment. As he walked down the corridor, he thought back to the flicker of movement he'd seen. Something about it felt different, not random, but intentional. Back in the monitoring station, David reviewed James's recent vitals. There was nothing unusual, but as he scanned the data, his instincts kept urging him to look closer. Later, when he returned to the room for routine checks, he noticed it again, a faint twitch, this time in James's eyelid. "Mrs. Harrow," David said carefully, stepping toward Eleanor. I think he might be trying to respond." Eleanor's expression hardened as she turned to David. "You think?" she asked, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "Do you know how many times I've been told to hold on to false hope? How many times I've watched for signs that weren't real?" David hesitated, feeling the weight of her words. "I understand, Mrs. Harrow," he said, his voice steady but imploring. "But this isn't just instinct. I saw his eyelid move. And earlier his hand. It wasn't reflexive, it was deliberate." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, pressing her fingertips to her temples. "The doctors have already explained this. They told me what to expect, random twitches, involuntary reflexes. It doesn't mean anything. David took a step closer, his heart pounding. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. You're right, most of the time, these things don't mean anything. But I've been with him every day. This felt different. Eleanor's gaze softened for a moment, doubt flickering in her eyes. But just as quickly, her defenses rose again. You're a good nurse, David, but you don't understand what this decision has done to me. If I let myself believe in something that isn't real, her voice cracked, and she looked away. David felt the tension in the room thickening, his own resolve starting to waver. What if he was wrong? If he pushed too hard, he risked alienating Eleanor and jeopardizing his career. But if he was right, the stakes were immeasurable. He glanced back at James, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. Mrs. Harrow, he said softly, all I'm asking is for a little more time. Let me monitor him closely for the rest of the day. If I don't see anything else, I'll accept your decision. Eleanor stared at him, her lips pursed in deliberation. Finally, she gave a small nod, though her expression remained guarded. One day, David. That's all. David exhaled in relief, but the pressure in his chest didn't ease. He knew this was only the beginning of what would become a race against time. As the hours passed, David kept a close watch over James, meticulously noting every detail. Each flicker of an eyelid or twitch of a finger felt like a puzzle piece, but the picture remained incomplete. Was he grasping at straws, or was something genuinely happening? David leaned closer to James, speaking softly. James, if you can hear me, give me a sign. Move your hand, blink, anything. He waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft hum of the machines. And then it happened, a slight movement in James's right hand. David froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He watched closely as the fingers curled slightly, then relaxed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like he wasn't imagining things. Encouraged, David continued. James, if you understand me, do it again. Move your hand. This time, there was no response. His shoulders sagged in disappointment, but he refused to give up. He adjusted James's position, ensuring he was as comfortable as possible, and went back to the monitors. Later, while changing James's foredrip, David noticed a subtle shift in his facial expression, a tightening around the eyes, as though he were reacting to something. He couldn't be sure if it was pain or some other stimulus, but it was undeniable. James was trying to respond. David jotted down his observations in the patient's chart, his handwriting quick and uneven. He felt a mix of hope and anxiety. If he was wrong, he risked giving Eleanor hope she couldn't afford. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that James was still fighting. When David shared his latest observations with Eleanor, her response was immediate and dismissive. David, she began, her voice calm but firm, we've been through this before. The doctors told me what to expect. Muscle reflexes, random movements, they don't mean anything. But Mrs. Harrow, David interjected, his voice tinged with urgency, these weren't random. His hand moved after I spoke to him. His expression shifted, like he was reacting to something. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. Do you know how many people have given me false hope over these weeks? Do you know what that does to someone? To hold on, only to be let down again. David paused, choosing his words carefully. I can't imagine what you're going through, he admitted. But I'm not trying to give you false hope. I'm just telling you what I saw. I believe he's trying to respond. She turned away, pacing the room. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, a barrier against the emotion threatening to spill over. If I let myself believe this, she whispered, and it turns out to be nothing, I won't survive it. David stepped closer, his voice soft but insistent. Mrs. Harrow, I wouldn't bring this to you if I wasn't sure. I'm asking for more time. Just enough to confirm what I've seen. Eleanor stopped pacing, her back to him. She stood in silence for a moment before speaking, her voice heavy with weariness. I don't know if I can do this again, David. You're asking me to reopen a wound that's barely begun to close. He didn't respond immediately, letting her words settle. Finally, he said, if it were my loved one, I'd want to know I did everything I could. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression conflicted. For a brief moment, the armor she wore cracked, and David saw the raw grief beneath. "Fine," she said quietly. "But only until tomorrow morning. If nothing changes by then, we move forward." David nodded, relieved but acutely aware of the ticking clock. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I promise I won't waste this chance." The hours crawled by, each one intensifying the weight of responsibility on David's shoulders. He pored over James's vitals and notes, scrutinizing every detail, searching for signs he might have missed. The faint flickers and movements he'd witnessed gnawed at him, their meaning tantalizingly elusive. Yet doubt began to creep in. What if he was wrong? What if these were nothing more than the involuntary reflexes the doctors had warned Eleanor about? He replayed the moments in his mind, the twitch of the hand, the shift in expression, but as time stretched on without further confirmation, his confidence wavered. David found himself lingering in the staff break room, gripping a mug of lukewarm coffee he didn't drink. A colleague approached, a veteran nurse who had seen her fair share of miracles and heartbreaks. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," she remarked. David hesitated before responding. "Have you ever felt like your gut was telling you something, but the evidence just wasn't there?" The older nurse smiled faintly. "All the time. But in this job, you have to walk the line between instinct and reality. Sometimes, holding on to hope is the hardest thing we do, for ourselves and for others." Her words lingered as David returned to James's room. He sat beside the bed, his fingers lightly brushing the patient's hand. "James," he whispered, "if you're in there, I need you to help me out. I need something stronger than what I've seen." The monitors beeped steadily, their rhythm a stark reminder of time slipping away. Then, suddenly, the line for James's heart rate spiked, not drastically, but noticeably. David froze, his pulse quickening as he watched the fluctuation stabilize. He leaned in, his voice firm but calm. "James, if you're trying to say something, keep going. Show me another sign." His gaze shifted to the man's face, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the corner of James's mouth twitch. Still, the ambiguity was maddening. Was he seeing what he wanted to see? Or was this truly the beginning of something extraordinary? It was nearing midnight when David decided to perform one last round of checks before his shift ended. The room was bathed in the dim glow of the monitors, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Eleanor had stepped out hours earlier, needing time to process the nurse's plea for patience. David adjusted the blankets around James, speaking softly as he worked. "You've got a lot of people rooting for you, James. I know you can hear me. Just give me one more sign." He didn't expect a response. After all, hours had passed since the last movement. But then, as he reached for the 4-line, James's hand twitched again. David froze, his eyes widening. This time, the movement wasn't just a slight tremor, it was deliberate, as though James was reaching out. David's pulse raced as he leaned closer. "James, it's me, David. If you can hear me, do it again." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in a motion so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, James's fingers curled around David's hand. A gasp escaped the nurse's lips, his heart hammering in disbelief. He sank to his knees beside the bed, gripping the hand that had just responded to him. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered, "You're still in there, aren't you?" As if in answer, James's eyelids fluttered. Not just once, but repeatedly, like he was struggling to open them. David scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the call button. "We need a doctor in here. Now." The monitors, which had been steady for days, began to shift. Heart rate, blood pressure, small but undeniable fluctuations that suggested something was happening. David's emotions surged, equal parts exhilaration and disbelief. He had been right all along. The medical team arrived quickly, their calm professionalism contrasting sharply with David's palpable excitement. "What happened?" asked Dr. Patel, the neurologist in charge of James's case, as she approached the bed. David gestured to James. He moved his hand twice and responded to my voice. His eyelids were fluttering, and his vitals spiked momentarily. "I'm telling you, he's trying to communicate." Dr. Patel raised a skeptical eyebrow, but maintained her composure. Let's not jump to conclusions. Reflexes can be misleading, and the family has been through enough false hope already. David stepped aside, watching intently as the doctor performed a series of basic reflex tests. She shone a light into James's eyes, checked his muscle tone, and spoke directly to him, her tone clinical. James, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand. The room was still. The medical team exchanged glances, their expressions neutral. David's heart sank. What if the signs he had witnessed were already fading? But then, Dr. Patel's voice softened. Wait. Look at his hand. James's fingers twitched weakly, barely noticeable but unmistakable. A murmur rippled through the team, and Dr. Patel leaned closer. James, can you do that again? Squeeze my hand. A pause, then the faintest pressure on her fingers. The team sprang into action, their previous skepticism replaced with focus and urgency. Orders were barked, monitors adjusted, and a flurry of tests began. Dr. Patel turned to David, her tone now serious. You might be on to something. We need to conduct a full neurological workup immediately. Eleanor arrived moments later, her face pale and drawn as she stepped into the bustling room. What's happening? She demanded, her voice trembling. David turned to her, his expression filled with cautious hope. Mrs. Harrow, I think your husband is trying to wake up. Eleanor's breath caught, her hands clutching the back of a chair for support.
What?
But the doctor said. I know, David said quickly, but we just saw him respond. Twice. Dr. Patel stepped in, addressing Eleanor directly. We're running tests now to determine the extent of his response. This could mean a breakthrough, but I must warn you, it's too early to draw conclusions. Eleanor looked from the doctor to David, her guarded expression crumbling as tears welled up in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a fragile sliver of hope. The atmosphere in the hospital room shifted palpably, the air crackling with cautious anticipation. The machines that once seemed to underscore the finality of James's condition now felt like lifelines, holding the potential for a miracle. Eleanor sat by the bed, her fingers clasped tightly together, her gaze fixed on her husband. Are you certain? She asked Dr. Patel, her voice trembling. Are you saying there's a chance? Dr. Patel met her eyes with measured seriousness. We've observed clear, deliberate responses. That's a significant development. However, we need more tests to assess his brain activity and determine the extent of his consciousness. It's a positive sign, but we're not out of the woods yet. Eleanor nodded slowly, her face a mixture of relief and fear. So, what do we do now? Dr. Patel explained the next steps, a series of advanced neurological tests, monitoring for consistent responses, and a reassessment of James's prognosis. These things take time, she added gently. It's important to manage expectations. Eleanor's hands tightened into fists. Expectations, she repeated bitterly. That's all I've had. Expectations that he wouldn't wake up, expectations that I should just move on. David, standing nearby, stepped forward cautiously. Mrs. Harrow, he said softly, I know this is overwhelming, but I believe James is still fighting. He just needs time. She turned to him, her expression conflicted. You've been saying that all along. And now, she faltered, emotion choking her words. Now I don't know what to believe. The tension in the room was interrupted by a low groan. Everyone froze. Eleanor's had snapped toward the bed as James's lips parted slightly, his throat convulsing as though he were trying to speak. James, she whispered, her voice breaking. David was at the bedside in an instant. James, it's okay.
Take your time.
We're here. The faint groan subsided, and James's face relaxed, but the moment left everyone shaken. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. He's coming back, she whispered, the words half in awe, half in terror. Dr. Patel placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. We'll do everything we can, she said firmly. But this will be a delicate process. Be prepared for setbacks. Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever it takes, she said, her voice steadier now. Just don't give up on him. For the first time in weeks, The room no longer felt like a place of endings. It was a battlefield, and James Harrow was proving he wasn't ready to surrender. Eleanor Harrow found herself in an emotional whirlwind she hadn't anticipated. Just hours earlier, she had been ready to let James go, convinced there was no path forward. Now, with his faint responses suggesting a flicker of consciousness, her resolve was crumbling. She sat in the hospital's quiet family lounge, her hands cradling a cup of untouched tea. The events of the day replayed in her mind, the twitch of James's hand, the groan that had escaped his lips. Was it enough to cling to? Or was she setting herself up for more heartbreak? David entered the room, his presence quiet but reassuring. "Mrs. Harrow," he began, sitting across from her. "I wanted to check on you." Eleanor gave a small, tired smile. "I don't know what to feel right now," she admitted. "For weeks, I've been bracing myself for the end. And now, it feels like I'm caught between hope and fear." David nodded, his voice gentle. "It's completely natural to feel that way. What you're going through is unimaginable." Her gaze shifted to him, her tone sharpening. "Do you really think he's coming back? Or are we just dragging this out?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "I can't promise what the outcome will be. But I've seen enough today to believe that James is still fighting. And I think he deserves every chance we can give him." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her teacup. "And what if this is all for nothing? What if I put him through more suffering, only to lose him anyways?" "That's a possibility," David admitted. "But ask yourself this. If James were in your position, what would he do? Would he give up on you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly. "He'd fight," she whispered. "That's who he is. He never gave up on anything." David placed a comforting hand on the table between them. "Then let's fight for him. Together?" Eleanor nodded, her decision made. She stood, determination etched into her features. "All right," she said. "We'll keep going." For him, the medical team worked tirelessly through the night, performing a battery of neurological tests on James. Dr. Patel led the team with precision, ordering brain scans, reflex evaluations, and cognitive responsiveness assessments. David hovered nearby, watching every movement, his heart pounding with equal parts anxiety and anticipation. In the early hours of the morning, Dr. Patel called Eleanor and David into her office. A series of scans illuminated the wall behind her. A faint but unmistakable series of neural spikes marked one of the images. She gestured to the scans, her tone cautious but optimistic. "This," she began, pointing to the spikes, "is brain activity. It's faint, but it's more than we've seen in weeks." Eleanor leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "What does it mean?" "It means there's a possibility that James is regaining some level of consciousness," Dr. Patel explained. "We're also seeing increased responsiveness in his reflex tests. These aren't just random movements, they're correlated with specific stimuli." David exhaled audibly, relief washing over him. "So he's waking up?" Dr. Patel hesitated, her expression measured. "Not exactly. We're seeing signs that his brain is trying to reconnect, but recovery from a state like his is unpredictable. It could be days, weeks, or even months before we know the full extent of his progress." Eleanor absorbed the information, her thoughts racing. "But he's not completely gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Dr. Patel said gently. "He's not completely gone." A heavy silence settled in the room as Eleanor processed the news. Finally, she spoke, her tone resolute. "What's the next step?" "We continue supportive care," Dr. Patel replied. "Physical therapy to prevent muscle atrophy, auditory stimulation to encourage neural responses, and close monitoring for further improvements." Eleanor nodded, her determination renewed. "Then let's do it." David, standing beside her, felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for the man on that hospital bed who was defying the odds. James wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a fighter, and they were all in his corner. The following morning, the hospital room was a hive of activity. James was being repositioned for physical therapy exercises, a precaution to maintain circulation and muscle tone. Eleanor stood by the window, her arms crossed as she observed the flurry of motion with a mix of hope and trepidation. The door swung open, and Garrett Harrow, James's younger brother, strode in. His tailored suit and confident demeanor were a sharp contrast to the emotional turbulence filling the room. "Eleanor," he said sharply, "I need to speak with you."
"Now?"
Eleanor turned, her expression tightening. "Garrett, this isn't the time." "I think it is," he countered, glancing pointedly at James's still form. "I just spoke with the doctors before coming in here. They told me you've decided to prolong this situation." His words dripped with disapproval. David, who had been adjusting the monitors, froze. He exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor, unsure whether to intervene. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice low and controlled. "This situation is my husband. And yes, I've decided to give him more time." Garrett scoffed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "More time? Eleanor, you're clinging to false hope. You heard what the specialist said weeks ago. James is gone. You're torturing yourself, and him, by delaying the inevitable." Eleanor's jaw clenched, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "He responded to us, Garrett. His brain activity is improving. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. And how many times have they been wrong?" Garrett shot back. "I loved my brother. But this is cruel. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment." David couldn't stay silent any longer. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrow," he said, stepping forward, "I've been with James every day. What I've seen isn't just reflexes. It's progress. Small, yes, but real." Garrett glared at him, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to make that call? You're a nurse, not a neurologist." Eleanor stepped between them, her voice firm. "That's enough. Garrett, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't your decision. It's mine. And I'm choosing to fight for him." For a moment, the tension in the room was suffocating. Garrett looked at her, his expression softening slightly, but his stance remained firm. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly before turning on his heel and leaving the room. Eleanor exhaled shakily, her composure cracking as tears welled in her eyes. David approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" She nodded, brushing away a tear. "I'm fine. I don't have the energy for this right now." "You're doing the right thing," David said gently. "I can see it in the way James is responding. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Eleanor met his gaze, her resolve strengthening once more. "Thank you, David," she said. "I won't." The room was quiet again, the activity from the morning now replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. Eleanor sat at James's bedside, her hand resting lightly on his, the other clutching a book she wasn't reading. David stood near the monitors, as always, watching and waiting. A faint sound broke the silence, a rasping, labored inhale. Eleanor froze, her eyes darting to James's face. His chest rose unevenly, his lips parting as though he were struggling to form words. "James?" Eleanor whispered, leaning closer. David was at her side in an instant, his pulse racing. "James, if you can hear us, you're safe. Take your time." He adjusted the oxygen tube, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. James's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, his pupils dilating as they adjusted to the light. Then they shifted, locking onto Eleanor's face. The weight of that gaze, though weak, was unmistakable. It was recognition. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "James! Oh my God, you're awake." A faint smile ghosted across James's lips. His voice, barely above a whisper, croaked out a single word. "Ellie?" The dam broke. Tears streamed down Eleanor's cheeks as she cupped his face in her hands, her sobs a mixture of joy and disbelief. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm here, James. I've been here all along." David, fighting back his own tears, called for the medical team. The room soon filled with doctors and nurses, but for Eleanor and James, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. She held his hand tightly, as though afraid to let go. James's weak smile persisted as he squeezed her hand faintly. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, the tide had turned. The news of James's awakening spread quickly through the hospital and beyond. By afternoon, Garrett was back, pacing the corridor outside James's room. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression guarded as she addressed him. "He's awake," she said plainly. Garrett stopped mid-step, his face a mixture of shock and relief. "Awake? Like, fully conscious?" Eleanor nodded.
He spoke.
"He recognized me. The doctors are still assessing his condition, but he's here, Garrett." For a moment, Garrett's tough exterior cracked, and his shoulders slumped. "I didn't think it was possible," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's tone softened. "Neither did I. But he's fighting, Garrett. He's not giving up." Garrett hesitated before stepping closer. "I'm sorry, Ellie. I didn't mean to push you earlier. I couldn't bear to see you get hurt again." She gave him a small, weary smile. "I know. But James is your brother. You should see him." Garrett nodded, brushing past her into the room. His confident stride faltered as he saw James, frail but undeniably alive, lying on the bed. James's eyes fluttered open, and a weak but familiar grin spread across his face. "Garrett," he rasped, his voice hoarse, but filled with warmth. "James," Garrett's voice broke as he approached the bed. He took his brother's hand, gripping it tightly. "You scared the hell out of us, you know that?" James chuckled faintly, his chest rising and falling with the effort. "Had to keep things interesting," he murmured. Eleanor stepped inside, standing beside Garrett. The siblings exchanged a glance, their years of shared history evident in their unspoken understanding. In that moment, the lingering tension between them dissolved, replaced by mutual gratitude that James was still with them. David watched from the corner of the room, his heart swelling with pride. He had seen miracles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a medical victory, it was a testament to the unyielding bonds of love and family. A week later, the hospital was abuzz with the remarkable story of James Harrow's recovery. Though still weak and requiring extensive rehabilitation, James's progress had been nothing short of miraculous. The story had spread beyond the medical staff, inspiring hope in patients and families alike. David was in the break room when Dr. Patel found him. She was holding a folder filled with James's latest test results, a rare smile on her usually reserved face. "David," she began, pulling out a chair across from him. "I wanted to personally thank you. Your persistence made all the difference in this case." David shook his head, a modest smile playing on his lips. "I just followed my instincts. James did the hard work. I'm just glad I didn't miss the signs." Dr. Patel placed the folder on the table. "Don't downplay what you did. You trusted what you saw, even when the rest of us were ready to write it off. That kind of intuition is invaluable. Not every nurse would have done what you did." Before David could respond, the door opened, and Eleanor stepped in. She looked more at ease than she had in weeks, her composure returning as the weight of grief was replaced with cautious optimism. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, offering a rare smile. "Not at all," Dr. Patel replied, rising from her seat. "I'll leave you two to talk." She gave David an approving nod before exiting the room. Eleanor approached David, her expression warm and sincere. "I wanted to thank you," she said, sitting across from him. "Not just for what you did for James, but for standing up to me when I couldn't see past my fear. You never gave up on him, even when I was ready to." David looked down, a little embarrassed. "I just did what I thought was right. I'm glad it worked out." "It did more than work out," Eleanor said firmly. "You saved him, David. And you gave me back something I thought I'd lost, hope." The words hit David deeply, and for a moment, he was at a loss for how to respond. Finally, he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harrow. That means more than you know." Eleanor extended her hand, and David shook it, the gesture one of mutual respect and gratitude. In that moment, the nurse who had refused to give up on a comatose patient and the wife who had found her strength to believe again shared a connection forged in resilience and faith. The weeks that followed were a testament to the power of persistence and hope. James Harrow began physical therapy to rebuild his strength, his every step forward celebrated by those around him. The therapy sessions were grueling, each exercise a reminder of how far he had to go. But James faced them with determination, his humor and wit returning in small but meaningful doses. Eleanor rarely left his side, her presence a steady anchor. The distance that had grown between them over the years, strained by busy schedules and separate ambitions, seemed to dissolve. She saw James not as the larger-than-life businessman, but as the man she had fallen in love with. Together, they spoke of the future, making plans in quiet whispers as he worked to regain his independence. One afternoon, James stood for the first time with the help of a walker. His face was flushed with effort, sweat dripping down his temple, but the smile that lit up the room was contagious. Eleanor clapped her hands together, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're doing it, James," she exclaimed. "I told you," James panted, his voice still weak, but laced with humor. "Can't keep me down forever." Watching from the corner, David smiled to himself. This was why he had chosen this path, to witness moments of triumph like this. Eleanor caught his eye and gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of his role in getting them here. Later that day, as the family gathered around James, laughter filled the room, a sound that had been absent for far too long. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like they were traveling it together. David Lawson sat on a bench outside the hospital, the crisp evening air biting at his cheeks. In his hands was a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. He was lost in thought, replaying the events of the past few weeks. It wasn't often that cases like James Harrow's ended on such a hopeful note. For every miracle he had witnessed in his career, there had been far more losses. Patients who didn't wake up, families who left the hospital broken. But this time, things were different. This time, his belief and persistence had made a tangible difference. He thought about the moment he had first noticed James's hand twitch, the nagging feeling that wouldn't let him give up. How close he had come to staying silent, to ignoring what his instincts told him. And then he thought of Eleanor, her strength, her vulnerability, and her eventual willingness to fight again when she'd thought all hope was gone. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen to see a message from his sister. Mom's scans came back clear. "Doctor says remission looks strong. Thank you for pushing me to keep her spirits up. Love you." A smile broke across his face, and for a moment, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. It wasn't just about James or Eleanor or any single patient. It was about what drove him to keep going every day, the belief that even in the darkest moments, there was room for hope. He finished his coffee and stood, ready to head home. As he walked through the hospital parking lot, he felt a quiet sense of purpose. He couldn't save everyone, but he could try. And sometimes, trying was enough. In the hospital room, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over James Harrow's bed. He was sitting upright for the first time in weeks, his features still gaunt, but his spirit unmistakably alive. Eleanor sat beside him, holding his hand as he recounted a memory from years ago, his voice still faint but steady. "And then Garrett tripped over the fishing net and went head first into the lake," James said, his chuckle turning into a soft cough. Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. "I wish I'd been there to see that. You two must have been quite the pair." James smiled, his thumb brushing over her fingers. "We were. And now we're all here. Together." Nearby, Garrett stood by the window, his arms crossed as he listened. He turned toward the couple, his expression uncharacteristically tender. "You've got a second chance, James. Don't mess it up." James grinned weakly. "Wouldn't dream of it." David entered the room with a clipboard, pausing at the door as he took in the scene. He hesitated to interrupt, but was quickly noticed by James. "There he is," James said, his voice filled with gratitude. "The man who wouldn't give up on me." Eleanor turned, her smile warm. "David, come in." David approached, his usual humility shining through. "Just doing my job," he said with a small smile. "No," James replied firmly. "You went beyond that. You fought for me when no one else believed there was a fight to be won. I owe you my life." David shook his head, humbled. "You did the hard part. I just made sure you had the chance." Eleanor stood, crossing the room to clasp David's hand. "You gave us more than a chance, you gave us back our family." As David left the room, he glanced back to see James and Eleanor leaning close, their foreheads touching as they whispered to one another. Garrett joined them moments later, pulling a chair closer to the bed. The scene was one of unity, a family piecing itself back together. Outside, the day was bright and full of promise. For David, the moment wasn't just an ending, it was a reminder of the power of hope, resilience, and the quiet but extraordinary impact of refusing to give up.